Well, thank you very much, Madam Chairman, and good morning, and thank you for coming on the second day of this very, very important series of evidence-taking and discussion that we've had. The North Carolina Commission of Inquiry on Torture, just to remind those who have not been here before, is a citizen-led truth-seeking commission to understand North Carolina's role in the post-9/11 rendition, detention, and interrogation program. And the discussions yesterday were truly humbling, amazing, and inspiring indeed. What I'd like to do is to just briefly, over the next few minutes, just kind of capture some, to use a relevant term, sound bites from the excellent testimony that we had yesterday regarding this important issue. Some of the sound bites from many of our witnesses, the first being the one takeaway that I got was just the horror of it all from Dr. Sam Raphael, who gave us an important overview in just the facts of what was happening in the RDI program. One of the questions that was asked is, where did we learn these techniques? These are Americans torturing. Where did we learn this? We also had an excellent overview on the international law and the human rights aspects of this by Juan Mendez, and he really emphasized the extensive international and domestic law violations by the United States in executing this program. Of course, we also had some really chest-grabbing moments related to some of our victims. Mohamedou Slahi said, "Just let me be me." Let me just say that again. What would you like to see done after you've gone through this horror by the United States? And his comment was, "Just let me be." That has really struck me as one of the more compelling statements, because as he was handed over and back into alleged freedom, he is very, very restricted in his movements. And all he would like to do is be able to go to Germany and see his family. Of course, our second victim was heartrending. And Qasim is actually having some issues. His wife clearly stated that maybe someday I hope he has faith and trust. And again, one of those cry-outs from victims of this horror that the United States had perpetrated. And of course, then we began to listen to some very, very important experts in this area with some very key aspects of things that the commissioners will certainly want to consider. One of the things I thought was very, very important was Steve Kleinman's excellent overview of ammunition to counter the narrative that torture is good. Again, as we just noted, that's being thrown around again by our current president and potentially an incoming director of the CIA about the use of torture and waterboarding, and of course this lodestone around our neck that Americans kind of seem to think, at least the majority of them think, that this is okay. So we do have to listen to Steve and think about countering this narrative that torture is good. I was struck by the imam yesterday who made this statement, and I think it's something that we need to continue to think about, and that is, excuses for torture are as bad as torture. I think that that is a very, very important, kind of a subtle point to make, but I think it's profound and it needs to be thought through. There are no excuses. It's a violation of international law, period. And we should not have any excuse for that kind of thing. One of the questions I didn't get a chance to ask because of time, but one of these that I'd like for you to to consider rhetorically, after comparing the United States of 10 September 2011 to the United States of 12 September 2011, 2001, excuse me. I'd just like to ask the audience and my fellow commissioners, given where the United States went after 9/11, did Osama bin Laden win? Did Osama bin Laden win? I was also struck by our healthcare professionals who came and talked to us about the medical aspects of the horror of torture, and it brought to me the sobering reality from someone who is not a healthcare professional, how deeply troubling these situations have made for not just victims, but also those who torture as well. And I think that's also very, very important. So many people suffer because of torture, not just the victims, but the torturers and the country that supports those torturers. On some administrative notes, I just want to, again, we are an open forum, and I've been asked by the Commission, again, to just remind those individuals who have served honorably and have served our country in the federal capacity that please be mindful of the restrictions related to classified information. And then the last more mundane point is if you would silence your cell phones, please. With that, Madam Chairman, I turn it back over to you.
So we will now call our first witness, Mr. Glenn Carle.
Thank you. Good morning. Everyone can hear me okay? Good. Well, I'm going to speak about two aspects of my career. Like many people, I wore different hats at different times, functionally and substantively. If any of you know me, you'll know that I was a case officer, and I interrogated one of the top members of Al-Qaeda, whom I may not name, but he was considered at the time one of the very top senior officers in the organization. So I did that, but I also, for the last almost 5 years of my career, 4 years, was in a senior strategic analytical position. I was for a time, the acting and then the Deputy National Intelligence Officer for transnational threats, which during those years meant that 98% of my time, and that's literally the case, was on one aspect of what would otherwise have been a broader portfolio, but it was on terrorism. And my job then was to assess what will happen over the horizon, not provide current intelligence reports or even assessments. So I'm going to speak about the two things because they relate. To the extent that I've had a public existence, it's because of my involvement with a man I call in my book Captus as a code name, and my involvement with the Enhanced Interrogation Program. So, and that's a gripping tale and an important one for the lessons that it offers. But we have heard and will hear a lot of details from our colleagues and associates on various aspects of what torture, enhanced interrogation, does to individuals, does to our institutions, and so on. So I will speak a little bit about that, but then I think wearing the other hat of the strategic analyst to describe what the rendition, intention, interrogation, enhanced interrogation programs have done to our perceptions as Americans and our institutions is actually a much graver and more significant story. But so how did I come to be standing at the podium? Not too long after 9/11, I was at headquarters in Washington. I was an operations officer. So CIA officers don't historically interrogate anybody. That's not a function that the institution performs, although we have, as an institution, done that at different times over the decades. That really isn't what we do. Our job is to recruit spies and steal secrets to get people to commit treason and to help the United States. So I had worked on terrorist operations, but interrogation is not part of what we did. I was at headquarters working on a non-terrorist related project, And my boss came to me and said, I'd like you to go on a temporary assignment. I'd like you to leave within 24 hours. These are verbatim statements. And he said, it is important to you professionally, it is important to the CIA, and it is important to the country. Will you do it? And that's literally all he said. And I said, well, let me call my wife. She had been in a coma and almost died, and was just it was mortal illness almost, and she was just convalescing. So it was an issue that I had to consider. And I called her and I explained the situation. She was always very good at these sorts of things. She said, well, look, of course, you pursued this career and took the oath for this kind of challenge, whatever it is, and so I will make do. So I didn't want to appear over anxious because my boss said you have 1 hour to work this out. So that phone call took 3 minutes, and I spent the next 56 minutes having a coffee and talking with friends so as not to appear too anxious. And then on the 59th minute, I went to my boss's office and I said, I can go. He said, go talk to so-and-so, who told me the following when I finally found the person in the counterterrorism center. He said, we have rendered a certain individual, he's one of the top members of Al-Qaeda, the interrogation is not going well. We believe that he has information that can lead us to Osama bin Laden. At the least, he has information that will allow us to destroy Al-Qaeda. We need you involved for reasons which I will skip, or probably shouldn't talk about. And he said, this is verbatim, it's one of the moments that's seared in my memory, such as when Kennedy was shot, or the space shuttle blew up, or one of those events in your lives. We were standing and he was talking to me like this, and he said, you will do whatever it takes to get this man to talk. Do you understand? And I physically recoiled because it was clear to me what he was talking about, and I was stunned. And this is not hindsight to make myself seem wiser or more courageous than the average person. This one I got right. I literally, at that instant, was quite conscious of what he was more than implying, and more importantly, what I considered that conversation and the assignment I was entering to be clearly for me the critical crisis moment of my then nearly 20-year career. And I also thought explicitly at that moment that it seemed to me to be the crisis moment, one of the critical turning points in the history, then 50-year history of the CIA. It just seemed obvious for an American official to allude to and discuss in an official capacity torture. I found astounding. Astounding, and it was very clear to me. One of the few surprises, I suppose I've had many surprises, one of the surprises I've had in this whole saga of my involvement and our nation's involvement in enhanced interrogation is that whereas I reacted with consciousness of the import of what I was being told and what I was becoming engaged in, the import was instantaneously obvious to me. And yet I seem to be, even still, an outlier. And I find that mystifying because my colleagues in the CIA are honorable and principled men and women who don't, on the whole, do a job. They and I really feel what amounts to be a calling. These are intelligent, educated, principled people who check their work and try to challenge their assumptions. And yet, I'm, to my knowledge, the only CIA officer who, to this day, who was involved directly in the enhanced interrogation program, who has spoken out as I have. The only others are those who are defending their careers and their decisions. That's because they created or implemented the program and now have become its defenders. So I went overseas and became involved. It was very clear to me from the first that that what we were doing came directly from the torture familiarization program, I'll call it that, of the US government, which is a very valid and important component of training for CIA officers or for military officers. We are at risk of being kidnapped and tortured. What do you do when you're helpless and you have information that can endanger lives, blood, treasure, and policy? There are actually some steps you can take to maintain some semblance of self. There's been a lot of talk about how the self is broken down and destroyed. And there are some few little things which I will not talk about, but that can give you some hope in a hopeless situation. So that training is relevant. But what I found was what is a torture familiarization and resistance program to help protect, in a way, our men and women was simply taken in its entirety and rebranded as an interrogation program when it's actually torture. These are basically the methods used are to alter your senses. I found, from my personal experience in a number of ways, in the operation of the interrogation that I was doing, as well as what had happened to me in my training, that sleep deprivation is the most powerful of the tools, and if not instantaneously, within, in my case, probably 36 hours, makes you half crazy. It's shocking how powerful it is. So the measures, which are detailed elsewhere, you may have heard about and aren't really the point right now for me, play upon the five senses. And I used to say, or I've described this, how do you do this? And we all know we have assumptions that guide how we interact with the world, and which give us a sense of ourselves, and that I'm standing here looking at several dozen people, and that we just know that to be the case. Well, how do we know that to be the case? And there are unconscious perceptions and convictions that lead to that. So, for the example is, we know the sun comes up once a day in the same place, and then it will set once a day in the same place, and then there will be night. Well, that sounds sort of stupid, but if you're in the hands of the CIA, that's not necessarily true. We can change day and night, and we can make your reality unrecognizable, and that will make you crazy. And the theory, I arrived in time to hear the talk about psychological dislocation. That was the theory, the objective of the measures. I always found that to be, I initially was skeptical, but I figured there were professionals who knew better than I. And as I became involved, I quickly concluded that not only was it wrong, but it also was sort of stupid, because it doesn't correspond to reality, as I think the professional psychiatrists and psychologists were describing. Certainly not in my experience and as I observe, but that's what tries to make happen. So I became appalled at this, and then the question becomes, and it always is, for an officer, what do you do? If you remove yourself, you'll have no effect. If you remain involved, you're implicated, and you may not be able to do anything. Do you have any agency, and can you have any effect? And what is your obligation to your oath? And there, it immediately became, instantaneously became powerfully clear to me that people in my circumstances were confronted with an impossible existential dilemma. If we follow our orders, we betray our oath, and if we disobey our orders to uphold our oath, then we will be personally destroyed and will have no effect other than to make a statement and to remove ourselves. I don't think I'm being melodramatic or glorifying myself or glorifying the position of people who are in the same position as I, to liken the dilemma to an honest, average German soldier who is assigned to Auschwitz. and told, no one comes out of that gate. If they do, you kill them. No one goes in. If they do, you kill them. And if you don't fulfill your orders and do your duty, we'll kill you, because you will then be, it's more than a court-martialable offense. And you know that behind that gate they're incinerating Jews. There's no way to act in a way that doesn't either destroy you, have no effect, or contribute to something you know to be profoundly wrong in every conceivable way. And it takes a rare individual to stand up and say no, because it will be your personal destruction. In the case of the German soldier, it would be your death. In the case of a case officer, it would be his professional destruction. Very hard to change. So that's what happened, but it's much worse than torture of an individual and an existential crisis of duty for officers and perversion of the institution. So I'll go from being a case officer to talking about what I actually think is the larger story, that we are living now well beyond what's brought us together, which specifically is torture, enhanced interrogation, and that kind of program. Because what has it done? It being the enhanced interrogation program, and I would argue it's had dramatically worse effects. So first I realized my involvement was a progressive series of expanding realizations and deepening horror and alarm, which is why I've spent the last decade becoming, to my astonishment, sort of the torture guy. I never imagined that my efforts to be a public servant, to serve my country, would consist of spending all my professional time really talking against torture performed by Americans as a policy. So what should be a puerile statement is the first thing you realize, of course, torture generically is bad. It's illegal, it's immoral, it's ineffective, it's unnecessary. Okay, that's bad. Torturing a specific person is arguably worse because it becomes three-dimensional and human. And that's just an appalling thing, and the consequences are what are bringing us together in psychological, human, policy, cultural terms, and that's terrible. And if that's all, and that's not meant in a derogatory way, all we were to focus on, that would be praiseworthy and important. But things are much worse than that. Because I realized as I was involved in the program that not only did we torture individuals, and in my case we tortured the wrong guy on top of it all, but that's a personal detail, but we broke and undermined our own laws, which I think is frankly more consequential than the tragic errors in treatment of specific individuals who were victimized by our program. The laws were clear and are clear. They were instantaneously clear to me. The Uniform Code of Military Justice, I think others can quote better. I can't quote it, but it's pretty clear on our obligations towards detainees. The then operative executive order for the CIA, which was called 12333 when I was working, has been superseded by subsequent ones, doesn't matter, was pretty clear about our obligations to the Constitution, to the law, and how to treat individuals. The United States Constitution is our founding document. We hear a lot about it from politically active people. I learned about the Constitution when I was in elementary school, and it's, I think, an obligation of citizenship, frankly, to know something about that, at least if you are a civil servant serving the flag, and it's as explicit as it can be, cruel and unusual punishments. The United States wrote the Convention Against Torture. It was promoted or supported and signed by Ronald Reagan, an arch patriot. The Geneva Conventions, which I literally raised in my first conversation when I was being briefed, they said, you will do the following. And I said, well, what about the Geneva Conventions? To which I was told, and this is relevant to why we're all here, with disdain, well, which flag do you serve? I responded with an epithet. But we wrote, the United States did, Eleanor Roosevelt negotiated the text written by the Department of State lawyers, the Geneva Conventions. They embody American ideals. They embody, I would argue, what a large part of the point of America is, which is to protect, to have the state serve and protect the rights of the individual, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, not an individual exists to serve the state. It was clear, we undermined all of that. That was worse to me, that our laws were made a mockery and weakened. If you break the law, okay, but if you then pervert the law, you undermine its foundations, and our entire legal system no longer shapes our national discourse or our private and public comportment, and our system of government and society, frankly, is gravely endangered. So breaking the laws as we did, I don't just argue, I know, is exponentially more grave a problem from the enhanced interrogation program than the ill and evil consequences of torturing specific individuals, bad as that is. But things get worse. Because not only did we torture people, not only did we break our laws, not only did we subvert our laws, but we undermined, literally, our system of government. All of us who take civics or are just good citizens and think about this, as we all should, and few do anymore, should feel that probably the triumph of American history, American society, American culture, and our government is the way we constituted ourselves for all of our inefficiencies institutionally. The separation of powers and the checks and balances designed in our Constitution and in our system of government is arguably, I would argue, the triumph of Western civilization for how to organize society and conduct public life and private life. But I experienced powerfully, and all of us are here because we are bearing witness to the fact that despite the incessant and heroic efforts of thousands of honorable and principled men and women in the CIA, in the State Department, in the Department of Justice, in the Department of Defense, it only took literally 6 people to usurp, bypass, and pervert and undermine the checks and balances and separation of powers of the United States government, so that we were not a democracy, and that I shouldn't use the imperfect tense, are not a democracy. We became a government of the rule of men, when 6 men said, you will do this. And when you say, what about the Geneva Convention? What about the separation of powers? It didn't matter. And if you challenged it, you were destroyed. And to me, that is even worse than undermining our laws, which itself is worse than specifically torturing people. But it gets worse. It gets worse. Because the question I asked myself when I was standing outside the black site, I literally did, I said, what have we done to ourselves? I am solipsistic enough to think this is really about us rather than the poor guy who's not an innocent that I interrogated. Because 15 years ago, it was inconceivable to have a discussion, an ostensibly rational discussion of American officials about the merits or demerits of torture. That was beyond the pale. Clearly, we prosecuted, convicted, and executed American soldiers for the war crime of waterboarding in the Filipino insurrection in 1902. we prosecuted, convicted, and executed Japanese intelligence officers and soldiers for the express war crime of waterboarding after World War II. And now, the man in the Oval Office, a majority of the Republican Party electorate, population, and the power structure and future members of cabinet say that it is necessary for the national defense and it is profoundly American to do so. It's a shocking change of who we are. If you poll Americans who are over 35, a strong majority of us, when asked if CIA officers should torture to protect us, say absolutely not. It's un-American. Of course not. The CIA exists to protect us from that sort of horror. You poll Americans who are 35 or under, and a strong majority of them say, you know, guys like Carle, they got to do what they got to do. It's okay. It's not okay. It's not the nation that I believed I had grown up in, and certainly that I took an oath to serve. But the worst consequence of all of this is that we have changed as a nation. Our democratic system is seriously eroded, so that the rule of law is now flouted, even in positions of power, people sworn responsible to uphold and protect the laws for the citizens who are not in power. And convictions, the sincere beliefs of a majority of our society have so changed now that we have become a nation that supports torture, which makes us, to me, seriously in danger of not being a democracy, not a society that tries to focus its energies on protecting and nurturing individuals, but becomes one of the exercise of power by men in positions of authority. And that's a horrifying description of a totalitarian state. And to me, the enhanced interrogation program, what I was involved in for a time, isn't the only cause. It was a precursor symptom, but it also had a serious contributing effect to the erosion of American democracy, which is far worse in consequence than the torture of the specific individuals whom we did torture, bad as that was. Thanks.
Commissioner Wilkerson.
Glenn, you don't have to answer this question if you don't want to. I fully understand. I happen to be at the peak of some of this discussion when it was taking shape. And one of the things that astonished me was the power of the bureaucracy. And by that I mean there were 12 to 15 interrogators in the FBI who were professional, good, experienced, language fluent, and so forth. And all of a sudden, what I saw was a disregard for them and their expertise, and a bureaucratic scramble between George Tenet at the CIA and Donald Rumsfeld at the Pentagon to get in on the game with amateurs. Can you comment on that?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think powerfully. It's something I lived intensely, and the dynamic that played out was not unusual. The FBI, in the view of the CIA, is not a serious intelligence institution. It's not an intelligence institution. They are not professionals, and they shouldn't be allowed into the operations of intelligence. They'll screw it up. Now, I'm using the hallway simplifications, characterizations of the agency. If I switch sides, I can give the FBI's counter interpretation of the agency. But that's a very powerful perspective. All stereotypes are based on some truth. So the dynamic was, this is very sensitive work. These are detainees or sources that we, the CIA, has obtained, and you don't let anyone else play in your sandbox because they will screw it up. So stay out. And it doesn't matter that you have interrogators. You guys are a bunch of law enforcement people. You're cops. this is intelligence work, and we'll handle it and figure it out. Because, you know, the case officers are the fighter pilots of the diplomatic and intelligence world, which means we're the most arrogant, most talented, most aggressive, and can do everything. And that's a hallway simplification of the perspective, but that's why it played out that way.
Thank you.
Commissioner Freeman.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Carle, for your testimony. And I very much appreciated your comment about that this matters more to us and should matter more to us than it should even to those victims in terms of what it's doing to ourselves as a nation. But I'm curious, one of the things that obviously is often spoken about for proponents and supporters of these actions is that it works. Given your vast experience, is there any instance that you can think of where it has actually worked?
Well, this was an issue of intense argument in real time among the various involved parties in the agency and the intelligence community, but especially the agency. That's where my perspective comes anyway. All of the intelligence reports obtained from several sources who had been subject to enhanced interrogation were formally recalled while I was still working. At the time, I was the Deputy National Intelligence, or maybe Acting National Intelligence Officer for essentially terrorism. And to recall a report is a consequential act in the intelligence world. You write up a report that Glenn Carle will be at Walgreens tomorrow at 3 a.m., you know, and you send it off, and then you realize, well, the source that provided this was lying or it's wrong. So if you send out a burn notice or a recall notice, not only is you do that because that specific information should be ignored and not allowed into the system for assessment, but you're commenting on the reliability of the source, and it's a grave matter in intelligence to issue a burn notice and to recall something. All of the reports obtained were recalled because the argument was correctly by those who momentarily won the argument that information obtained under duress was clearly suspect and not to be trusted. And we learned that some sources were having sort of schizophrenic kinds of behavior, and you don't think we should trust people who are both Mary and Tom simultaneously, and so on. It was clear to me, and to all my professional colleagues, I believe, who worked on interrogation, that what seems common sense is correct, which is if I cause you such pain that you'll do anything to make it stop, you will say anything to make it stop. And I'm not likely to win your support or affection or inclination to be helpful if I am causing you pain and angering you. So you're more likely to be resentful and vindictive and therefore less trustworthy. It's clear. There's no instance I'm aware of, or any officer who does this substantively, and there are two gentlemen who've done it infinitely more than I in front of us, who I think will say the same thing, who says that information provided under duress, meaning from torture, can be useful. Let's assume that the information that I obtained from you is actually truthful, but I obtained it under torture. What's forgotten by the proponents of that position, that, well, look, it worked, is that that's only one step, getting someone to say something. And if you are a minimally competent intelligence officer or institution, you never believe anything. And you have to, literally, you have to assess the reliability and try to independently substantiate, corroborate the information. So you have a bit of information, but your task is only beginning. And since the odds are sort of obviously higher that the information is going to be unreliable, you have to vet it, because if you go running off to the intersection that he tells you, you might be running into a trap or in a false direction. So it doesn't help at all. The only proponents of whom I am aware people who make that argument are the small numbers of people who were involved on the policy level designing and ordering this kind of program, which is torture, or those who implemented it and are implicated in it. No one else, no one that I know has, aside from the unwashed who are susceptible to the views of their leaders, and I say that unfairly, snidely, who don't know what they're talking about, however sincere and convinced they are. You know, the dentist in Peoria who says torture works because my leaders say so doesn't know what he's talking about. No one says that it works. No, no.
I have a question. Torture is a war crime and a crime against humanity. You know, at Nuremberg, the defense of superior orders was found not to be a valid defense, and it is carried over into modern international criminal law. Carrying out an illegal order, you have also just committed a war crime or a crime against humanity. Would you like to comment on that, please?
I get asked a lot if I support, and I came to be an associate and friends with some of the people in here on in this very issue. As many of you seek to have justice served to uphold the law, to set a precedent, to show that there are consequences to acting in such harmful, even evil ways. I have always taken the position, since this became part of my life, that I haven't supported prosecuting people. Ignorance is not a defense before the law, but I am seeking what I think is a larger objective. I feel strongly, it's clear that individuals broke the law, and by any definition that makes them criminals, and here is the punishment in our legal codes for this kind of behavior, and you have to enforce the law for our system to work. That is all true, but I think that the approach that President Lincoln took towards the South is probably the wiser one, which is to not deny that these people were traitors, but that the larger goal is to change how our society lives and believes. And if we prosecute people who acted in good faith, or even if they didn't act in good faith, but were the leaders of half the nation, has the support of half the nation, instantaneously, and this has happened already, of course, you will have a circling the wagons, polarization, tribalization of the issue, and the facts no longer matter. We live in an age where we have discovered, to our chagrin, the facts are largely irrelevant, and emotion counts for everything. So my goal is to have the American public repudiate torture as fundamentally un-American and evil. But that won't happen if we polarize the situation. It will happen if we change people's perceptions. And it's like developing a source, frankly, but at the level of a nation. You don't develop the source by alienating him. You plant perspectives that he or she is unaware are becoming his perspective, so that he or she comes to agree with you. Yeah, I'll answer this question for you, Glenn. And then you have won. So by not prosecuting, but by working to convince even those now who support torture, and the Republican Party, frankly, that torture is a legal and necessary step and shows manliness and courage as a nation, that in fact it's a betrayal of who we are and a betrayal of our flag. That's a larger objective than having justice served to X number of people for me.
Respectfully, I couldn't disagree with you more.
Commissioner Coleman.
Thank you. In listening to the testimony of witnesses yesterday and listening to your statement today, it seems to me that what we're dealing with is something of a loss of faith in the rule of law and other fundamental values. The assumption of your position is that the rule of law can protect us from the threats that we face. It seems that the public no longer believes that. And and politicians have basically led it not louder. Okay, and politicians have led the public not to believe that. So the question is, and I think the question for this commission too, is how do we restore the public's faith in the rule of law to believe that that's sufficient to protect us from the threats?
This, I'm afraid, will sound more cynical than I think probably all of us would like to be. I hope it's not cynical, but I've come progressively over the years to believe and fear, but recognize the power of the individual leader. You know, we're living this phenomenon now. I made the point last night during the dinner. Shockingly, facts are only relevant to a small fraction of the population who can reason. It's a secondary order of response, is to be rational. The primary order that dominates most things, and importantly in unconscious ways, is an emotional response that's inferred and taken from the parameters of acceptable belief and behavior that we imbibe from our environment and from the people we recognize as our leaders. So if the leader says the moon is made of cheese, or that's an alternative fact, even if you know, many people know that that is not true, that's secondary to the more powerful reality, which is that a substantial proportion of the society will accept it. You believe the statements of your tribal leaders. We are largely visceral and instinctive rather than rational. So the way you would change things is you have to one has to use endlessly at every level the bully pulpit, and speak out in public and say, no, 2 and 2 is 4, torture is bad, but from a position of authority or influence. And that will then start to shape people's positions. You know, if we argued that 2 and 2 was 6, we'd have as much, I'm afraid, almost as much effect. That sounds really cynical, I know, but that's why we are in our political circumstances and why people support torture, because they've heard for 15 years there are bearded people behind every bush who are trying to kill you, but I'll be strong and I'll protect you and I'm in the know. And you go, well, okay, that makes sense. You're supposed to know that. You know, if I were to say, as George Bush did repeatedly, the problem is with small numbers of individuals, not with a faith. These certain measures are effective. We can be strong while affirming our principles. People will accept that too. And we've been graced for 200 years, on the whole, with leaders who affirm the norms that we all hold so dear. But when leaders don't, you end up with a McCarthy or a Father Coughlin or someone more contemporary.
Thank you. We are unfortunately running short on time, so as usual, we've gotten some excellent audience questions to the witnesses. We ask that you approach Mr. Carle during the break because we unfortunately don't have time to ask them all now. You can also submit them to NCCIT, and we will take them into account as we produce our final report. So please join me in thanking Mr. Carle.
Thank you.